Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, all about emotions as your personal map. So let's start by setting the understanding that our human body is a highly developed emotional and physiological instrument of feeling and sensing. We have so many neural pathways coming from our sense organs, including our skin, our eyes, our ears, smell, taste, all of these different ways of perceiving and sensing, including something called interoception, which is that ability to sense inside. Sensing, it could be sensations, emotions, even sensing feelings from different organs. All of these neural pathways travel from our body to our brain to be interpreted and understood so that we can navigate the world. So being an emotional, physiological instrument of feeling and sensing is truly one of our greatest superpowers, because this ability to sense and feel is exactly how we navigate our world. It's our own personal map or sonar. And it is influenced by beliefs and values. So when somebody has a certain set of values, they resonate, they will feel strongly being in a certain community or a certain environment versus somebody else. So it's highly individualized. And if you are a sensitive person, meaning you feel a lot, then you're really going to benefit from understanding how to train your system and calibrate it so that it's finely tuned and useful to you without overwhelming you. And one of the first ways to start to understand that is to stop labeling emotions as bad or good. Emotions themselves are information. And when we can start to look at that as information, we can start to really use that as a way to navigate the world. Oh, and here's a quote included from Carl Jung. "Real liberation comes not from glossing over or repressing painful states of feeling, but experiencing them to the full." So what we really want to be able to do is to have a full emotional palette. I often used to think about old boxes of crayons, where you only had 8 colors. Well, we want to turn that into all the colors of the rainbow, the big box of crayons, so that you can start to make distinctions between things like sad, grief, sorrow, distinctions between anger, frustration, the difference between resentment, guilt. All of these are different ways so we can really start to understand the nuances and the subtleties. And the more you can understand your own sensitivities and your own subtleties, it's going to help you feel empowered and informed. So oftentimes people talk about being labeled too sensitive. Either they're labeled that at a young age from maybe a parent, or they've labeled that themselves, where they just feel that they get overwhelmed by the world, overwhelmed by their own state of feelings, and then also sometimes overwhelmed by other people's feelings. So I'd like to point out that it isn't a weakness. It's just that oftentimes we aren't given an owner's manual to understand our emotions. And so it can end up feeling like it overpowers us and overwhelms us. And so the goal here is to create a healthy space from emotions. So for those people who don't feel their emotions enough, they need to get a little closer. And for those people who feel their emotions too much, they need a little bit of healthy distance. And I like to think about the idea of a weatherman doesn't have to be standing out in the rain in order to tell us about the storms. So if you're having an emotional storm, you don't necessarily have to be out there caught up in it. You want to be at that place of the observer self and able to recognize these are the emotions that are informing me right now, but without feeling overwhelmed or like the emotions are in charge. Emotional sensitivity, it refers to just heightened responsiveness to the full spectrum of emotions, both positive and negative. So people who are emotionally sensitive just feel emotions more strongly than others, and they're going to be more affected by other people's emotions and the environment around them. Now that's different from emotional dysregulation, which is about having difficulty in being able to regulate the emotions. That's when you feel like your emotions carry you away, are they in charge, that you can't intervene with your own emotions in order to find them or to help them be at a workable state. So that can be unstable emotions, difficulty controlling emotions, maybe being impulsive or self-destructive. That's what we really mean when we talk about emotional dysregulation. And one of the trauma-informed ways to think about understanding your emotions and the emotions that you carry is this idea that regardless of what has happened to you, if these emotions are now in your body, it is up to you to learn how to work with them and to heal them. So it's a way of having actually a sense of responsibility, which in some ways is a very loaded way to look at that. But yet when we take personal responsibility for what's happening inside of our own bodies, that's what really actually opens us up to the idea and the understanding that we have agency, we have power, we have the ability to change. So it's not your fault what's happened to you. But now that these feelings or sensations are inside of your body, it is going to be up to you to figure out how to heal them and to be able to move forward. And that doesn't mean that you do it alone, but it does mean that these things that exist within you are now yours to caretake for. And so when we start to have that view, that's how we start to take our power back, especially from our emotions and from our traumas. So emotions move like a wave. In fact, the Latin root of the word emotion is energy in motion. The concept here is that the sensations kind of awaken into our consciousness. They start to build in intensity, reaching a peak. Then there's this level of containment where the emotion is sitting in the body, and then it moves to completion or resolution. So one of the biggest skill sets that a person can do when learning how to work with their emotions is tolerance. How can you practice riding this wave of emotion? Now, one of the most important things here is that people often think, I can't handle it. We have fears that it's going to get worse, that it will last forever. And so the ability to remind yourself that these emotions and sensations are in my body, they're going to rise to a peak, they're going to stay there for a short while, and then they will start to move on their own. And this is such an empowering way to start to understand emotion and how to take care of yourself within your emotions, because it's allowing you to go directly to the source of what's happening in your body. Now, that's not to say there's nothing wrong with having stress reduction distractions or calling a friend or doing things to help be with emotions, but sometimes there's just simply almost nothing we can do with our emotion other than to be with it. And again, it's just so powerful to understand that actually the power of our own internal awareness and attention that is directed inside is exactly what's often needed to help things move towards resolution. So the gift of our own awareness is very, very powerful. And typically that's exactly the opposite of what we've been taught. We're kind of taught culturally, and I mean, even our brains tend to move away from pain. So when we start to have discomfort inside of us, there's a part of us that just wants to avoid it, to ignore it, to numb out, to distract ourselves. But typically that's what actually starts to keep things stuck. And that's what starts to lead to like emotions and things feeling like too much or overwhelming or piled up, is because there's like a history or a backlog of emotions and sensations in your body that have been ignored. And so what they need the most is to be able to be given the right amount of spacious awareness and attention. And this is typically where things like patience, curiosity, and self-compassion really come in, because those are the tools that we need in order to be able to sit with ourselves without judgment and without an agenda of trying to make things change. So emotions are complex. They're not always straightforward. They're nuanced and subtle. So sometimes our job is to simply be with the emotions and sensations without trying to understand them, without telling a story about them, and without trying to make them go away. In fact, the main thing that I was actually taught to parents from a psychology perspective about helping kids learn their emotions is that you help children name their emotion, you help them find where it's at in their body, and then you remind them it won't last forever. And honestly, that is some of the best tools that we honestly still need as adults as well. This is what I'm feeling, this is the sensations connected to it, and then remind yourself it won't last. So when it comes to emotional literacy, the number one thing to do is to learn how to identify and name your emotions and your sensations. If you can, identify the source of your emotions, and then choose your response. Now, choosing your response might be a choice of, I don't need to do anything, or it might be a source of action. So that choose your response is still about putting you in the driver's seat. So here's a great graphic for understanding or for using and building your emotional literacy. Typically we separate emotions into good or bad, or just happy or sad. And it's nice to have those bigger categories, but the truth is you want to be able to branch out like the many branches in a tree, because the more specific you hear and feel yourself, then that's what helps the body understand that the emotion's been recognized. Essentially, the information's been delivered. So you have this graphic actually in the workbook that you can either print out or use or reference, but definitely I would suggest referring back to this quite a lot, especially as you move through this program. You won't always need it, but it's very, very helpful in the beginning to just have the vocabulary for examples, because the truth is also when we're feeling a lot, sometimes it's hard to practice like recall and to come up with like the variety of feelings that we have. And here's another way to also understand your emotions, and a really helpful way to identify where you're at. The concept here is that we've got an upward spiral and a downward spiral. And what's really interesting is where the two meet is this mix between contentment and boredom. So as you start to look at this is a good way to start to ask yourself and to differentiate, where am I at here? And you can also see how, for example, with the boredom, how sometimes that's a clue for some people that boredoms can be the gateway towards depression. And what's also especially interesting about this graphic is it really highlights how depression and hopelessness being at the bottom of the spiral, that typically when a person is starting to heal and come out of their depression, one of the first emotions and sensations they experience is actually anger. Now, anger is a confusing feeling for many people because they've either been taught that it's not okay to be angry, or it's confusing because they just don't know what to do with their anger. But that aside, anger is a really helpful and important emotion. It helps us identify boundaries. It helps us identify when a line has been crossed and action is needed. So when a person starts to experience anger as they're arising out of their depression, that's actually a really positive indicator that things are starting to move and shift. So that's a helpful framework for holding space for your own anger. Now here's a totally different category. We're not quite talking about emotions in this graphic. We're talking about sensations. Twitchy, dizzy, tender, squirmy, sweaty. These are all different examples of body sensations. And again, if you recall how we talk about how all the neural pathways that move from our body, from our sensory organs, and travel to the brain. So sensations are felt in the body. Typically, that's mostly run by the subconscious mind. So the subconscious mind is what does like pumping our blood and our breathing and all kinds of things that we don't have to like consciously think about. And that's where like emotions and sensations can be really confusing for people, because it's hard for some people to actually feel the feelings. They just know I'm mad. And then that question of, well, where do you feel it in your body, can be a frustrating process in the beginning, because it moves so lightning quick that their brain knows they're mad. And it takes a little while to start to learn how to slow down to the pace of the body and to really feel like, oh, I felt heat in my fists and tightness in my shoulders. So one of the ways of learning how to be and tolerate with your own emotions is to ask yourself, okay, what are the sensations I'm experiencing in my physical body? And again, it requires a true slowing down. Our brains are often lightning fast, but the body communicates at a bit of a slower pace. And that being said, it's important to also reference and call out that numbness counts as a feeling. So feeling nothingness or numbness is an important thing to identify. It's close also to feeling kind of guarded. Sometimes that's a feeling that you can kind of feel like your protections that are preventing you or keeping you from feeling deeper. So if you're feeling numb or guarded, really honor that as one of the first layers of starting to get closer to your body sensations. So again, part of tolerance and learning to be with emotions is emotional literacy, to be able to name the emotion, to fine tune specifically what emotion you think you're feeling, to identify where you're feeling it in your body. And that could be like, I feel it in my heart or my solar plexus, or it could be like, I feel it as a shell all around me. So it doesn't have to be like a pinpoint place. And then remind yourself it won't last forever. And then to begin to practice, what is it like to sit in that emotion? To sit with it long enough that you start to watch it. And what often happens as we're watching our own emotions is they do start to shift. It can sometimes feel a little hard to follow it or to find it. A lot of people are really, they want to avoid the idea of sitting with their emotions because they don't want to play a victim or they don't want to wallow in emotion. And so they pull out of it really quick. So there's actually a lot of value in being able to sit with emotion. That's not going to make you get stuck in it. In fact, it's kind of a reverse psychology. The more you can go directly to the source of what you're feeling, the quicker it typically will release or resolve or move forward. So we've included some exercises and reflections for this chapter. And what I'd like to encourage you to do is to take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes and focus your attention on your body. And imagine feeling your body on the inside. Remind your brain to take a break from the outside world and give yourself permission to be very present in this moment without telling any stories or explanations about how you're feeling. And then from there, start to notice, what sensations am I feeling in this moment? As you continue to focus on those sensations, where does your curiosity start to go within the body? This is just practice to begin noticing. And then you can ask yourself, what sensations do I typically feel when anxious versus what sensations do I typically feel when I'm peaceful? And then it's a useful question to start to identify what sensations feel stuck. What sensations and experiences feel like they're just always in your body or they're there kind of on repeat. Then moving on to emotions. What are my most familiar or common emotions? Which of these emotions surprise me or feel unfamiliar? What emotions feel stuck? And then ask yourself, what emotions would you like to experience more frequently? And take yourself a bit on a daydream or use your imagination to begin to sense what would it feel like to have this new emotion in your body. Remembering that the power of imagination is one of the ways we lay new neural pathways in our bodies. So imagination is not just something for children. It's a great example is to think about like sports psychology. People will replay the game or the move or whatever it is that they're supposed to do over and over in their heads, and that will actually increase their success rate of the game they're playing or the sport they're playing. And so we can also use that same concept as far as stress reduction, emotional tolerance, and creating new neural pathways, is to be able to imagine what it would feel like to be at peace, to imagine what it would feel like to have joy, or to simply imagine what it would feel like to be neutral as you move through the world instead of stressed. And I'm not suggesting that stress is actually a very important emotion for us to have. But if it's been a stuck emotion, we have to start to then use some interventions to remind our body about that full emotional palette. Okay, that completes chapter 4.